Goodnight lecture hall here, where sleep is a journey and history is a detective story. Forget everything you know about the witch hunts from the movies, because today we're taking a microscope to the past, not a broomstick. We're cracking open medieval court archives to ask who was the real prey in this hunt. For centuries, a long, heavy, and suffocating shadow has loomed over the history of Western civilization. It is a shadow that stretches across generations, cast not by monsters from the abyss, nor by demons from the underworld, but by the very neighbors we lived beside, the families we broke bread with at the communal table, the friends we confided in, and the sacred institutions we trusted to save our immortal souls from the darkness. To truly understand the witch trials, we must first look past the flickering, hungry flames of the stake. We must look past the cold, rusted iron of the torture chamber and the screams that once filled the town squares. We must look deeper into the silence that followed. We must look into the freezing, dark corners of the human psyche, where fear is not just born, but meticulously cultivated, watered with suspicion, and harvested for power. This was not a sudden, accidental explosion of collective madness, as many historians would have us believe. It was a slow, calculated, and highly organized construction of an enemy. It was a masterpiece of social engineering. And that enemy was, almost without exception, the woman who dared to stand outside the tightening circle of total submission, the woman who walked the edges of the forest, the woman who did not lower her eyes. The era we often associate with the hunt was not the dark ages of the medieval world. Ironically, it was the dawn of the so-called modern age, a time of profound transition, devastating plague, and violent religious upheaval. As the old feudal certainties began to crumble like dry sand in a storm, the world became a terrifying, unpredictable place. People were lost, searching for a reason for their misery, and the system gave them one. When the crops failed in the frozen fields, when mysterious illnesses claimed the youngest in their cradles, or when the social order felt threatened by the winds of change, the collective mind of the community demanded an explanation. But it did not seek truth. It did not seek logic. It demanded a face for its suffering. And through a lethal, calculated combination of theology, law, and patriarchy, that face was decided upon long before the first accusation was ever whispered in the dark corners of a tavern. It was the face of the feminine. It was the face of the other. The woman was the perfect target, visible enough to be blamed, but marginalized enough to be defenseless. The anatomy of this fear was rooted in a profound pathological anxiety regarding female independence. In a society where a woman's value was strictly defined by her relationship to a man as a piece of property, a silent daughter, or a dutiful mother, the woman who existed on the margins became a source of existential dread. Consider the widow who managed her own land with a steady hand, answering to no master. Consider the healer who understood the secret, silent language of herbs and the cycles of the moon. Consider the midwife who held the terrifying, godlike power of life and death in her very palms. These were the first to be viewed through the distorted, cracked lens of suspicion. They possessed something the system could not quantify, could not tax, and therefore could not allow to exist: autonomy. To be independent was to be in league with the shadows. This fear was not organic. It did not grow from the earth. It was engineered. It was a great humiliation of the feminine spirit, orchestrated by those who held the absolute power of the pen and the terrifying authority of the pulpit. They crafted a narrative where the natural world was a battlefield, and women, perceived as inherently weaker in both mind and morality, were the most vulnerable to the devil's whispers. By demonizing the woman, the state and the church could explain away every failure of their own governance. If the village was starving, it was not because of high taxes, war, or corruption. No, it was because a woman in a cottage at the edge of the woods had looked at the cattle with an evil eye. It was always easier to burn a woman than to fix a broken, decaying system. The smoke from the pyre served as a curtain, hiding the incompetence of the powerful. We must realize that the witch hunt was, at its very core, a war against the self. It was a systematic effort to strip women of their social power, their dignity, and their connection to the ancient traditions of their ancestors. The fear of the witch was actually a fear of the woman who knew too much, the woman who lived too loudly, the woman who refused to be silent in the face of a punishing social structure. Every accusation was a brick in the wall of a new kind of prison, a prison that was not made of cold stone or iron bars, but of a pervasive, paralyzing atmosphere of suspicion that turned sister against sister and daughter against mother. This was the beginning of the Great Silence, a silence that would last for centuries, echoing through the halls of history. The update to the human soul was complete. Fear had become the new law. Welcome to the anatomy of fear. Welcome to the beginning of the end. If the previous chapters revealed the darkness of the human soul and the cold logic of the law, then this third chapter exposes something more grounded, more cynical, and perhaps more devastating. We are often taught to think of the witch hunts as a product of pure religious fanaticism or medieval ignorance. But behind the thick, acrid smoke of the inquisitorial fires, there was another sound, sharper and more persistent than the prayers of the faithful. It was the clinking of coins. This was the economics of the stake, a complex, self-sustaining financial system where the death of a woman was not just an act of piety. It was a highly profitable investment. It was an era when the systematic oppression of women acquired a specific, calculated market value. The witch hunt was a lucrative business, and like any industry, it required resources, labor, and yielded massive dividends. In Europe at the time, a legal practice existed that today seems like the height of institutionalized madness. The property of a convicted witch was immediately confiscated, but it did not simply vanish into the heavens. It was meticulously carved up and distributed among the church, the local lords, and the very judges who pronounced the sentence. This created a monstrous circular incentive. The wealthier the woman, the more sinful her soul appeared to be in the eyes of the law. Widows who had inherited their husband's fertile land, independent women who owned successful shops or weaving workshops, they became the primary targets. Their independence was not just a social threat. It was capital that the state and the church hungered to absorb. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this economy was the bill of death. We must look at the surviving ledgers of the time where the costs of murder were itemized with the cold precision of a merchant. The relatives of the accused were not just left to mourn, they were legally obligated to finance the destruction of their own loved ones. They were billed for the woman's upkeep in the freezing cells. They were billed for the executioner's specialized travel fees. They were billed for the heavy iron chains, the ropes, and even the very wood used to build the pyre. The system did not just kill the woman, it turned her family into involuntary shareholders of her execution. It was a process of total financial extraction, leaving the survivors not only broken in spirit, but destitute in life. This environment gave birth to a new kind of predator, the professional witchfinder. Men like the infamous Matthew Hopkins turned suspicion into a high-paying career. These were bounty hunters of the soul, receiving massive fees for every head they brought to the stake. They were deeply personally invested in ensuring that the number of witches never dwindled. If a town was quiet, they would manufacture a crisis to justify their fee. Suspicion became a commodity, and fear was the currency of the day. This economic pressure ensured that the machine of the Inquisition never ran out of fuel. As long as there was property to seize and fees to be paid, the flames would never truly die down, but the cost was not just measured in gold. It was measured in the total collapse of human trust. Informants were often promised a share of the confiscated property, turning neighbors, friends, and even desperate siblings into predators. The social fabric of the community was torn apart for profit, cloaked under the sacred veil of the cross. This was the architecture of isolation. A woman could no longer trust another woman because the price of her life was now equivalent to a few acres of land or a handful of gold coins. The system had optimized fear, turning it into the most efficient tool of enrichment for those already in power. In this chapter of our history, we see human life being converted into cold numbers on a ledger. The witch hunt was the first large-scale operation to systematically push women out of the economic life of Europe. It was a process of enclosure, not just of physical lands, but of human opportunity. The stake was the final point in a transaction where the price was a woman's life and the commodity was her right to own her own future. We look at these dusty figures today and realize behind every record of expenses for firewood stands a shattered fate and a stolen heritage. The economics of the stake taught the world a lesson it has never forgotten, that oppression is not just a moral choice, it is a business model. The gold is gone, but the debt remains unpaid. Welcome to the price of silence. While previous chapters revealed the darkness of the human soul and the cold, unyielding logic of the law, this third chapter exposes something more grounded, more cynical, and perhaps more devastating. We are accustomed to thinking of the witch hunts as a product of religious fanaticism, an era of collective madness fueled by superstition. But behind the thick, acrid smoke of the inquisitorial fires, there lay the persistent, rhythmic clinking of coins. This was the economics of the stake, a complex, self-sustaining financial system where the death of a woman was not only an act of piety, but a highly calculated and profitable investment. It was an era when the oppression of women was not just an ideology, but a machine that acquired a specific, measurable market value. The witch hunt was a lucrative business, and like any successful industry, it required resources, it demanded labor, and it yielded massive dividends for those at the top. In Europe at the time, there was a legal practice that today seems like the height of institutionalized madness, the total confiscation of property from the accused. But the wealth did not simply vanish into thin air. It was distributed with surgical precision among the church, the local lords, and the very judges who pronounced the sentence. This created a monstrous, self-perpetuating incentive. The wealthier the woman, the more sinful her soul appeared to be in the eyes of the hungry court. Widows who had inherited their husband's fertile land, single women who owned successful shops, workshops, or independent trades. These became the ideal targets. Their independence was not just a social threat, it was liquid capital that the system hungered to absorb. To burn a witch was to clear a title deed. We must look closely at the surviving ledgers, the itemized bills presented to the families of the deceased. It was the ultimate cold-blooded mockery. The relatives of the convicted were legally obligated to finance every stage of the murder. They were billed for her upkeep in the freezing cells. They were billed for the executioner's specialized fees and his travel expenses. They were built for the heavy iron chains, the coarse ropes, and even the very wood stacked for the stake. The system did not just kill the woman, it forced her loved ones to pay for the privilege of her destruction. It was a complete financial extraction, ensuring that female wealth was not just taken, but that her lineage was left destitute. Entire fortunes flowed from the hands of independent women into the pockets of professional witch finders, such as the infamous Matthew Hopkins. These men turned suspicion into a high-paying profession, receiving bounties for every head, making them deeply invested in ensuring that the supply of evil never ran dry. Economic oppression went hand in hand with social erasure. By stripping a woman of her right to property, the system stripped her of the very possibility of resistance. In a world defined by land and coin, a woman without either was an invisible creature, a ghost with no voice in court and no protection in the community. The witch hunt became a tool for a massive, violent redistribution of wealth. Female independence was declared a diabolical temptation, specifically to justify what was, in reality, a common robbery. We see here the birth of a structural inequality that would haunt us for centuries. The pervasive belief that a woman with her own resources is an anomaly, a danger, a thing that needs to be corrected by the state. Furthermore, this economy created an atmosphere of total poison-laced betrayal. Informants were often promised a share of the confiscated property, turning neighbors, lifelong friends, and even desperate relatives into predators. The social fabric of the village was torn apart for profit, always cloaked by the shadow of the cross. This was the architecture of isolation in its most effective form. A woman could no longer trust another woman because the price of her betrayal was now equivalent to a few acres of land or a pair of gold coins. The system had optimized fear, turning it into the most efficient tool of enrichment for those who already held the sword and the gavel. In this chapter of history, we see human life being converted into dry numbers on paper. The witch hunt was not only an ideological war, it was the first large-scale operation to push women out of the economic life of Europe entirely. It was a process of enclosure, not just an enclosure of lands, but an enclosure of human opportunity. The stake was the final point in a transaction where the price was a woman's life, and the commodity was her right to own her own future. We look at these ledgers today and realize, behind every record of expenses for firewood stands a shattered fate and a stolen heritage. The economics of the stake taught the world that oppression could be profitable, and that is a lesson, unfortunately, that humanity has learned all too well. Welcome to the price of the soul. The economics of the stake took land and property from women, then this fourth chapter is dedicated to how their very knowledge was stolen. This is the story of how one of the oldest, most vital, and most respected female roles, the role of the healer and the midwife, was declared a criminal act. This was the War on Midwives. It was a deliberate, centuries-long campaign to push women out of the healing arts, transforming the sacred act of assisting birth into a cold instrument of state control. The witch hunts became the primary tool through which the emerging male-dominated medical profession monopolized the right over the human body. For millennia, the knowledge of herbs, pain relief, and the delicate rhythms of childbirth was passed down from woman to woman, whispered from grandmother to granddaughter. The midwife was the central pillar of the community. She knew how to ease the agony of labor, she knew which roots could stop a hemorrhage, and she knew exactly how to care for the fragile life of a newborn. But it was precisely this deep practical wisdom that became her death warrant. For the authors of the Malleus Maleficarum and the inquisitorial judges, a woman's ability to alleviate pain was not a gift, it was suspicious. The Church taught that pain in childbirth was a divine punishment for the sin of Eve. Therefore, if a woman could heal without a priest's prayer or official approval, then her power must have been stolen from the devil himself. The logic was as simple as it was horrific. No one harms the Catholic faith more than midwives. We must understand that this was a raw struggle for power over the most intimate process of human existence, the process of bringing life into this world. The male physicians of the time were men of books and scholasticism. Their knowledge was often limited to abstract theory and ancient texts, and they could not compete with the lived, practical experience of women. Instead of learning from these women, the medical establishment decided to destroy them. The witch hunts allowed traditional healing to be branded as black magic. The use of ergot to stop bleeding or poppy to dull the edge of pain was turned into evidence of sorcery. The woman who understood the secrets of nature was declared a witch, systematically removed to make room for the man with a university degree and a stamp of official authority. Oppression in this chapter takes the form of forced amnesia. Entire layers of folk medicine and botanical wisdom were burned along with the women who practiced them. The consequences were catastrophic. When midwives were pushed out and replaced by male doctors, to whom religion and social taboo often forbade even looking at female genitalia, mortality during childbirth skyrocketed. But the system did not care about the death toll. The goal was not to save lives. The goal was to establish a hierarchy. The female body became a territory to be conquered, mapped, and subjected to permanent male surveillance. Furthermore, midwives were held cruelly responsible for the tragedies of nature. If a child was born dead or with defects, the woman assisting the birth was the first to be blamed. She was accused of sacrificing the infant to Satan, a lie used to mask the medical ignorance of the era. This created an atmosphere of unbearable, paralyzing pressure. Every failure, which was inevitable in those times, became a potential reason for a trial. Knowledge was turned into fear, and the act of assistance became a life-threatening risk. In this chapter, we witness the triumph of rigid institutions over ancient intuition. The witch hunts destroyed the continuity of female experience that had been forged over countless centuries. We still feel the echoes of this war in modern medicine today, where female pain is too often dismissed and the process of childbirth is stripped of the woman's own agency. The witch was in reality the first doctor to have her license revoked by the flames of the stake. This loss of knowledge remains one of the quietest yet most tragic pages of the Great Oppression. The healers were silenced so that the masters could speak. Welcome to the birth of the object. If the previous chapters of our journey described the abstract coldness of laws and the calculated greed of economics, then this fifth chapter is dedicated to the brutal physical reality of oppression. We embark now on a journey through the geography of torture, from the lightless dungeons of Bamberg in Germany to the misty paranoid fields of Salem in America and the rugged, windswept shores of Scotland. This is the story of how the courtroom space was transformed into a laboratory for the total destruction of the human persona. Here, the oppression of women reached its absolute terrifying peak. It moved from paper and accounts directly onto nerve endings and bones. It was no longer about the crime, it was about the body. The geography of the witch hunts was not uniform, but everywhere it pursued one singular dark goal: the total breaking of the female will. In Bamberg, Germany, the process was turned into a science. They built special witch houses, the Drudenhaus, These were not mere prisons, they were prison laboratories designed for the maximum extraction of suffering. In Bamberg, torture was not an accidental outburst of local cruelty, it was industrialized. Women were deprived of sleep for many days and nights until their minds began to fracture. They were forced to stand in tubs of ice-cold water until their limbs went numb, or forced to sit in witch chairs lined with sharp, rusted spikes. The goal was never to obtain the truth. Truth did not exist within those stone walls. The goal was to create a confession that would confirm the paranoid, feverish fantasies of the judges. In this space, the woman ceased to be a human being. She became an object for extracting the necessary words. Oppression in this chapter manifests through the absolute deprivation of the right to one's own body. In Scotland and England, a different kind of map was drawn upon the female skin through the practice of pricking. Professional prickers, men who made a living from suspicion, would strip a woman naked before a jeering crowd. They would search every inch of her body for a witch's mark, a spot supposed to be insensitive to pain. Often this was done with blunt needles or through clever sleight of hand, but the result was always the same. It was an act of profound public humiliation aimed at destroying the very foundation of female dignity. The woman's body was declared the property of the state and the church. It was an object that could be pierced, shaved, and inspected without any hesitation. Across the ocean in Salem, America, the geography of torture took a more psychological form. Here the physical rack was used less often than in Europe, but the community itself became the instrument of pain. Social isolation and relentless pressure were the tools of choice. Teenage girls, acting as instruments in the hands of powerful adult men, pointed fingers at those who were different. In Salem, we see how oppression breaks not only the muscle but the mind. Women were forced to testify against their own sisters, their own mothers, their own daughters. It was a sophisticated torture of choice. Die as a righteous woman on the gallows, or live as a traitress in the shadows. Most confessions in Salem were not acts of guilt. They were acts of absolute despair, an attempt to save a physical life at the agonizing cost of losing a soul. We must realize that torture was never just a way of collecting evidence for a trial. It was a ritual of purging the social space of female agency. Every device, from the Spanish boots that crushed bone to the thumbscrews that tore flesh, was designed to turn an independent woman into a screaming, broken creature, ready to confirm any lie the patriarchy required. In this geography of pain, the woman lost control over her own voice. Her words no longer belonged to her. They became part of a pre-written script authored by her executioners. The confession was the final act of her erasure. This chapter of our history teaches us how easily the space of justice turns into a space of terror. If one group of people decides that another group is not quite human. The geography of torture was a map of male fear, inscribed onto female bodies, and we still carry this genetic echo within us today. The fear of speaking the truth, the fear of standing out, the deep, hollow sensation of dread before institutions of power that once considered our suffering a necessary condition for social order. We look at these iron instruments in museums today and we must remember, they are not just cold exhibits, they are monuments to the moment when civilization decided that the female will have to be shattered so that the system could continue to function. The map is old, but the territory is still being fought over. The silence is the only thing they left behind. Welcome to the geography of ghosts. The 6th chapter leads us into the most painful realm of oppression, the realm of human relationships. If torture broke bones, then the stigma of silence broke bonds. We explore how the witch hunts were used to destroy female solidarity. This was a massive operation of disconnection. The system transformed trust into a dangerous luxury and betrayal into the only available means of survival. In this chapter, we see how oppression seeps under the skin of society, forcing mothers to fear their daughters and friends to see each other as mortal threats. So the crowning achievement of the architecture of isolation was the destruction of female spaces. For centuries, women gathered at wells and markets or during shared labor, creating an invisible network of support and exchange of knowledge. The witch hunts declared such gatherings suspicious. Any group of women whispering in the twilight could be accused of organizing a Sabbat. Social proximity became evidence. To avoid suspicion, a woman was forced to demonstrate total isolation or total loyalty to patriarchal structures. Thus, the very concept of female community was destroyed, replaced by an atomized mass where every woman was on her own. The most horrific manifestation of this oppression was the involvement of children in the process. Judicial chronicles from Salem and Europe are riddled with cases where young girls were forced to testify against their mothers. This was the ultimate form of psychological sadism. The system destroyed the most basic biological and emotional bond. A child whose mind was poisoned by sermons about the devil became the perfect instrument of accusation. A woman betrayed by her own child lost not only her life, but the very meaning of her existence. It was a stigma that could not be washed away for centuries, a brand of betrayal scorched into the heart of the family. Furthermore, the system encouraged denunciation through economic and social bonuses. To be a good Christian woman meant pointing a finger in time at anyone who behaved incorrectly. And this created a culture of constant surveillance, a prototype of the modern panopticon. Women were forced to monitor each other, watching their clothes, their glances, and how long a neighbor lingered in the forest. The fear of being next turned victims into accomplices. Oppression reached its goal. It forced the oppressed to control each other more effectively than any executioner ever could. The stigma of silence led to female experience becoming hidden. Knowledge about the body, the right to protest, and inner strength, all of this went deep underground or was forgotten. We lost centuries of female history because telling it was mortally dangerous. Silence became a survival strategy passed down from generation to generation. We are still struggling with this legacy. The difficulty of trusting other women, the habit of competing for the system's approval, and the subconscious fear of being too noticeable. In this chapter, we realize that the most enduring prison is the one we build inside ourselves out of fear of others. The witch hunts did not just kill thousands of women, they killed trust among those who survived. They created a world where silence was the only safe sound, and suspicion was the only honest feeling. We look at this past and see how deeply the bonds of solidarity were severed, and we realize how much effort is required today to repair these broken threads. The final chapter of our journey brings us to the present day. We are accustomed to thinking of the witch hunts as a distant historical curiosity, a relic of a dark past that now lives only in horror movies or costume parties. But this is a great deception. The witch hunt did not end. It evolved. It transformed from the open flame of the stake into the hidden mechanisms of social control that still define a woman's life today. In this final chapter, we explore the final update, how centuries of genocide shaped the modern world, and why the image of the witch is still used to silence women. We see this legacy in language. When a strong, ambitious woman is called a bitch, hysterical, or crazy, these are not just insults. They are echoes of the very same accusations of witchcraft. The system can no longer burn a woman physically, so it burns her reputation, her voice, and her right to emotions. The stigma of hysteria that dominated 19th and 20th century medicine is a direct continuation of the Malleus Maleficarum. Female passion, anger, or dissent are still perceived as something pathological, requiring external control and treatment. Oppression today has taken the form of standardization. The witch hunt once destroyed those who were different, and today that process continues through social media filters and beauty algorithms. We have created a digital panopticon where a woman must conform to a narrow, predictable template to be accepted. The single woman, the woman without children, the woman choosing a path outside the patriarchal family, she still feels the cold gaze of society, the same gaze of the Inquisitor looking for nonconformity. We have replaced witch marks with counts and trend compliance, but the essence remains the same: control through the fear of being rejected. Furthermore, we have turned a real genocide into a fairy tale. By making the witch a caricature in a pointed hat, we have committed an act of collective displacement. It is a way to forget that hundreds of thousands of real women were tortured to strengthen the power of the state and capital. We romanticize the stakes so that we don't have to feel guilt for the fact that the foundation of our modern civilization is literally mixed with the ashes of those who knew the secrets of life and death. This is the aesthetics of disappearance in action. The real history of pain is erased and replaced by a bright, safe simulacrum. But even in this world permeated by algorithms and old fears, the voice of the witch is beginning to sound again. Today's interest in spirituality, the return to folk medicine, and the struggle for bodily autonomy are acts of restoring broken connections. We are beginning to understand that the magic the Inquisitors feared so much was simply human power that did not recognize chains. Intuition suppressed for centuries is returning as a tool of resistance in a world that has become too mechanistic and cold. As we conclude this cycle, we must admit the history of the witch is the history of each of us. It is a reminder of how easily society can turn compassion into hatred for the illusion of security. It is a warning that any system striving for absolute efficiency will always try to destroy those who do not fit into its calculations. We stand on the ashes of the old world and look into the future, realizing that the battle for the right to be oneself, for the right to one's voice and one's body, is an endless process. The system update is never final. But as long as we remember the names of those who went to the stake with their heads held high, as long as we restore the bonds of solidarity and refuse to be convenient variables in someone else's equation, the fire in our hearts will be stronger than any stake. History is not over. It is simply waiting for us to write its next chapter. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into history. If our work has given you a new perspective, please consider subscribing. It's the best way to show that stories like this deserve to be told. Until next time, in our shared space of memory.